There we go. And good evening. We are going to do kind of we've had a couple of classes with guest speakers, and we are having another guest speaker later this week. It's a little weird when we have this condensed class and we do everything inside of 4 weeks. And then I have my guest speakers who are amazing, and they're so excited to talk to you guys that they're using the full block of time. But I hope you're okay with that because I mean, honestly, I'm excited because I'm learning as I go as well with them. And so I love having, people who are on the cutting edge of research come and speak to us. Um, Today, what I want to do is I want to pick up on a couple of things that are either kind of floating out there in the modules or things that we haven't quite gotten to yet. So we're going to do a little bit on the tail end of some social emotional stuff and get a little bit into the beginning of equity as well. Our speaker on Thursday will really touch on more strongly on the equity piece. He's the lead editor on the Culturally Responsive Teaching and Gifted Education, or in Twice Exceptional Education, that just came out a year or so ago. So he's currently cleaning up his life from the hurricane that came through, but he's okay, family's okay. So he'll be with us later this week. We're going to start today with talking kind of generally about the social emotional needs of our gifted and twice exceptional students. We're going to do a little bit on perfectionism, a little bit on executive functioning. Both of those are meant to be much more concrete, more like this. These are things you guys can do in the classroom. These are ways you can frame some of the work you're doing. So we've been doing a lot of theoretical. Those parts of them will be, I think, much more concrete. And then we're going to go, like I said, a little bit into the equity piece of things. Talk about, again, you guys have done the reading on some of the theoretical stuff. We're really going to ground it in kind of what the reality is for us. Yes. And then from there, we'll have our break at some point, probably in between the social emotional and the equity. And then I'm going to kind of gauge from you guys where we're going to go after that. I've got a couple different ways I can go. And so I just kind of will probably want to get a feel for you. I have been updating the attendance, which is not anything you guys can see in PDO, but the reason it's important is because I'm going to send emails out to folks if you've missed more than one class as of today, because we're about the halfway point today. If I send you an email and you have been here in class, what it means is I don't have you recorded on the attendance. And so don't freak out. Just let me know which classes you've been to, and I can go back in and pop that in. But make sure if you're watching videos on your own that you are putting in the attendance for the date that you covered. And then also when you're here in class, make sure you're putting in attendance as well, and kind of keeps popping that into the chat for everybody. So if we don't have any questions to start our day, I'm going to go ahead and get going with our first presentation. Does that work for everyone, or does anyone have questions that they need answered before we start? Excellent. All right, so I am going to share. I guess I should put my presentation on before I share my screen. There. Oh, there. We're going to share that. Okay. So I believe you can see what I want you to see. Hopefully you can see what I want you to see, which is my understanding and addressing social emotional needs. So I will tell you that these ones, when I wrote them, the lens for them was more for gen ed teachers, which a lot of you guys are. When it comes to our twice exceptional learners, they look a lot more, I think we've said before, they look a lot more, especially when it comes to social emotional needs, they look a lot more like a typical gifted kid than they do like a typical student with special needs. And when you have a gifted student with ADHD, autism, whatever, they will have more in common with other gifted kids than they tend to have with kids who have their same profiles but are not gifted when it comes to addressing those social emotional needs. So that's kind of the lens that we're going to go at this with. The advanced learners are a really interesting breed because, as we've talked about before, not all advanced learners are gifted and not all gifted kids are advanced learners. So some of this will be true for them. When we get into perfectionism, that's going to really touch a lot on to our advanced learners, because sometimes the traits that make you an advanced learner are also the ones that lead to issues around perfectionism. So we're hopefully kind of hammer through some of that stuff today. So this is an older quote, but it's one that I really like to kind of start off with. And Rick talked about this last week as well, that we know that common behaviors in gifted children can be misinterpreted as symptoms of attention problems. So specifically, we see a lot of behaviors in gifted children that we might ascribe to ADHD more than anything else. And he really did a great job talking about the intensity, some of the oppositionality, the hyperactivity, that need to move and be kind of physically involved with it is what you're doing. And so it really is an important thing to be able to understand some of the difference between normal ranges of behavior for gifted children versus what we might consider to be different or disordered behavior for students with disabilities. And then you've got the other category of our gifted kids with disabilities who kind of will span the whole range of that. Ultimately, the big reason why it matters is because it matters somewhat in how you're addressing it and why we're addressing it. First, I just wanted to touch really quickly on a couple of these pieces around the professional learning piece of this. I know SEL is like a thing now, and it's a big thing right now, but what I wanted to bring to people's attention is that it is not only grounded in research, but there are professional organizations out there that set the standards for these different areas or competencies, and it is an expected part of instruction and professional learning for our teachers. Many of these things have been around for a very long time. And I just feel like, especially post-pandemic, we talk about them a lot, but I do want to make sure that we know and understand that this has been part of our educational lexicon for a while, even if we didn't call it SEL learning or whatever it was there. So when we look at CASEL, CASEL is the national body that talks about what they call competencies. They don't call them standards. And they break them into five domains: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. National Association for Gifted Children, we've talked about, that's our professional organization for gifted instruction and gifted education. And we talk about all of these different areas, and you find them across our standards of both professional learning as well as standards of instruction. And then there's the MCPS BWell 365, which really aligns itself to CASEL. So even though it's in MCPS speak, it does actually align back to what CASEL tells us we should be doing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I really just kind of want to make you more aware of it than anything else. So CASEL is, like I said, it is a professional body. This is the circle that they talk about. I always joke with education, if you can put it into a circle or a pyramid, you can probably sell it for something. So this is the big circle that they talk about when we talk about the social emotional learning and the why of social emotional learning. And so we have like the different components of it, we have the different settings, and then kind of where and how and why we do the instruction that we do. This presentation is linked into the module for session 3. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to talk around it. When we talk about SEL specifically, like I said, there's 5 areas, and the same is going to be true when we get to executive functioning, where there is as many as 14 different areas. Please do not try to learn them all at the same time. You will drive yourself nuts, you will hurt your brains, and you will become frustrated with the entire thing. Ask me how I know. Instead, what I really think that is best is to do the overviews. And that's why I really like these little videos here. Each one of these is between 2 and 5 minutes, and they give you an overview of, what do we mean when we're talking about self-awareness in terms of social emotional learning? What do we mean by self-management? Once you kind of get through all those, I would either pick the area that you feel like you're strongest in and really kind of apply yourself and deep dive to learn more about it, or pick the area that you're least confident in and learn more about it to kind of bolster yourself. And build yourself over time. This is not a do it this summer thing. This is kind of a more long-term, these are the areas that I want to bring more awareness to my classroom. One thing I think most people find is a lot of the pieces that they talk about are things we're already doing in our classrooms. We just don't put names to them. So, when we talk about something like responsible decision making, we might talk our kids through problem solving. We might talk about positive and negative consequences. Whether or not in your mind you call that SEL instruction around responsible decision making, it's probably likely that you don't, but the truth is you're doing it. And so some of the professional learning around SEL is really building confidence in your own repertoire and knowing you're doing a lot of these things, and here's the research to back it. Then there's also going to be pieces where you might be like, oh, I haven't really thought about needing to incorporate that or needing to provide direct instruction in that area. I want to learn more about it so that we can better incorporate it into the classroom. I think, when we're talking a lot about the social awareness piece with our kids, I think that's something, we know that we have our kids generally mean well, they want to do well, but we might not think about needing to teach them empathy specifically. We might not think about needing to have conversations that expressly say, let's take somebody else's perspective, or let's look at this in a different perspective. And we might be doing something within our classes that we can tie that in and help our students build those skills. And maybe by thinking about it more explicitly, it'll be easier to bring it to the forefront. Some of what Rick was talking about last week with the bibliotherapy also really touches in on these and how you can do them in the classroom, specifically more in our humanities and language-based courses, but I think those are good things to know. Again, I'm not going to have us watch the video, but one thing I really like with this particular video, it talks about the future self. And one thing we know about success with students and success with people in general is you build yourself for success because you see yourself being successful in the future. If you don't consider yourself in the future and you don't consider, what you want to be, where you might be, and you don't plan for that, it's harder to build skills that are going to get you there. So if we have students who are really just living the day to day and they don't see, and we get a lot of this, right? Like my favorite example and other people's least favorite example, I'm sure, is why do I have to learn math? I'm never going to learn math in my life. I don't care about math. Okay, fine. I get it. I'm an English teacher. I don't care about math either. I'm sorry, math teachers, but I don't. But can I see where math plays a role in my life? If you force me to, I absolutely can. Anything from trying to decide if I'm buying stuff on Amazon today or how much I really can afford to spend, or the fact that my kid's going to camp next week and do I really have everything? And, so not only that executive functioning, which we'll talk about later, but just the numbers of having to get her there. How long is it going to take? Do I have the money for gas? So do I need to buy her new shoes? Like those are all actually real world math problems. Our kids aren't thinking about that. We need to teach them to think about that. And then in a broader sense of, my future self, it becomes true of those interpersonal relationships. It becomes true of empathy. It becomes true of responsible decision making. We need to help them see that the choices that they're making now and the process they go through to make those choices and make those decisions have an impact on the future. And it helps develop and build them as to who they are going to be when they get older. Students who don't envision themselves in the future have a lot harder time being successful in the now because they don't see it going anywhere. And what we also know is that if we're not building them towards something and school becomes a thing to do in the now, when they get to the end of school, they don't know what to do next because they get used to this setup, right? Like school, you go to first grade, second grade, third grade, it's all handed to you, it's all laid out. Even when we're asking them to make choices, if they're not buying into those choices, if they're not building towards something, they're just allowing it to happen to them. And then they get out of school and things don't just happen for them. They have to go find a job or they have to go to college. When they get to their job or college, they have to make these. So again, that's all that career readiness piece, but it really does root itself back into their buy-in to their education when they're younger. And these are a lot of foundational pieces that we we imbue in them as teachers, whether or not we realize we're doing it. And so really thinking about each of our students, not only as they are now, but as they might be in the future, and how they see themselves in the future is a really important part of the SEL learning. So I'm not gonna read these to you again. This is kind of exploratory. But NAGC does have multiple standards that directly or indirectly talk about the need for specialized instruction for social emotional needs of our gifted children. So I think there's 7 standards, and you can see 5 of them have these direct pieces that they talk about. Oops. So we talked a little bit already, we did about having a sense of self-understanding, understanding, that they have needs and they have different needs, and that we need to be able to help them identify and find resources to support their own needs. Helping them understand how to talk and be a part of their families. And, frequently gifted kids come from gifted families. And if everybody, just like with ADHD or some of the other pieces, if everybody there has got it, that's their world, that's their reality, but they don't have the support and the resources they need or the awareness that they need, they're not going to be as successful as they could be. And so part of what we do is teaching them about those characteristics, but also helping them with resources. When we talk about talent development, and Rick talked about this a little bit last class, but in terms of our own classrooms, bringing in that, and this, to me, was where things like pre-assessment become so important, because we can't develop talent if we assume the kids know everything or if we assume they know nothing. If we figure out what they do and don't know, then we can help them better develop their talents to figure out, maybe they do need this reinforced so that they don't feel like a failure, but maybe they don't need this directly instructed to them. They already know it, and we can move them forward into something that is more interesting or more of a buy-in for them. We want to teach them to become independent investigators. That, to me, is a really huge part of what we do for our gifted and our twice exceptional students. And I see this, and I think we all see this, where the kids are always looking to us for reassurance. They're always looking to a figure of authority to be told, yes, you're doing it correctly. And what we want them to be able to do is to be able to go out there and try to learn how to check themselves, to learn how to say, I think I did do this right, and say with confidence, I'm ready to submit for you to look over this, as opposed to, well, what about this? What about this? What should I do next? Where am I going next? Our gifted kids need to develop the social emotional talent to become independent and be those independent learners and investigators. The other unfortunate truth of it is that a lot of times, one of the myths of gifted education is that gifted kids will be okay. They learn on their own. They don't need any additional support from teachers. And the way that often translates into the classroom is, I've got to help the kids who are behind. The kids who are at or ahead, they're fine. But they're not fine, and we know they're not fine. But if in that context where I have to help the kids who aren't there yet, but I can do instruction with these other kids who have the content piece down, to have them work on some of those other talents and skills, like being independent investigators, and giving them and teaching them the skills to do the independent work or to do the independent research. That is something that we can do as teachers to support in a multi-needs classroom. The learning environments piece really is going to talk about our classroom, our education environment. What are we doing to make it a space for them to show competency, for them to build the social skills? Very frequently, gifted kids are strong leaders. They are not always good leaders, and they are not always positive leaders. Gifted kids will use their leadership talents for their own amusement. So if we don't give them a space to do it appropriately or instruction on how to be good and positive leaders, they'll find their own avenues. It's one of those things where leadership is one of those quality areas where, when we think about especially our underrepresented populations, very frequently our students who are being under-identified for social reasons display leadership qualities that will often also get misconstrued as negative qualities, because they also tend to challenge authority, and they tend to buck the status quo and they suggest ways of change or ways to do things differently, all of which are positive things. But if you are not looking at them through a positive lens, they tend to look like defiance or aggression or other negative traits that people want to ascribe to our students. Um, and it's a fine line to walk because you can do the exact same thing and it really becomes the interpretation of the person who's labeling. And so we need to know and make sure our students know that doing all those things is fine. It's good. It's a part of being, especially when you're gifted with something like leadership. It's that communication piece, it's that social competency piece where we want to help them build those social skills so that they can be the true change makers that they really are and the true leaders that they really are. We talk about variety of programming and coordinating services. Again, much like with special education, gifted education talks a lot about services and serving our students. We know that a lot of times when we talk about gifted ed, it's really focused on curriculum. And curriculum is a very important part of it. But just like our special education students need services in order to be able to access their instruction, our gifted kids need services as well in order to be able to access appropriate instruction. And then the professional development piece, I'm actually gonna come back to this later. So I said MCPS has their 365, and you can see it follows along with CASEL and everything else: positive members, managing emotions, building resilience, identifying access and support, peacefully resolving conflict, and positive decision making. So it's all very echoey across the board of what we're trying to do. So these next few slides are really just kind of meant to be a visual indicator. One thing I found when I've talked about our kids over time, and I think this is true of myself, which is why I like this as a visual. We can say, you know, Claire said last week, you know, so you met one twice exceptional kid, you've met one twice exceptional kid. And the truth of it is that's true of absolutely every single child. But we are able usually to cluster and categorize and think about the kids. But when we also think about the differences in our students, we also want to be able to kind of think our way through what do we really mean when we're talking about differences and similarities and who it is that we're working with. So I had seen this visual many, many years ago, this idea that when we're talking about specifically the picture was talking about the autism spectrum, and when people have a spectrum, they often think of it as I would say mostly debunked and previously called low functioning to high functioning. And people think of it as that like kind of horizontal spectrum. But the truth of it is that, like everything else, it is both a horizontal and a vertical spectrum. And it's not whether you're high functioning or low functioning, it's where are your needs, where are your intensities, where are your strengths, where are your weaknesses. And when we talk about our twice exceptional kids and we talk about kids with disabilities, what we're really looking at, kind of like we were talking about last week with the idea of a bell curve, if we think that we have these ranges of what we would call typical areas, and that's what these orange lines on the screen are, if we have these lines of what we would consider fairly typical behavior, even when in the world of typical, you have different needs, and all of these sliders are literally just visuals to say, look, things can be far apart or close together. So when we think about a typical student, in this case, we have a typical student where most of their things are kind of falling in these typical boundaries. But you can see even within the area of typical, there are strengths, there are weaknesses. And there are relative strengths and relative weaknesses. And then there are true weaknesses and true strengths. And this is true of every single child. Wherever those slider bars fall, all of our kids kind of look like this. And then sometimes, you know, we might have a kid like this. This again, to me, would be a very typical student whose needs all and strengths and needs all fall within these boundaries. They again have some relative lows, they have some actual highs, but everything is kind of falling in this more typical range. So when Claire's talking about that idea of planning for the extremes, this is why we planning for the edges. This is why we plan for the edges, because both this student and this student fall within this middle area, but neither one of them are the same. Neither one of them have their needs across a line in the middle. And so when we're planning for these edges, they can move their own sliders up to where they need them to be. Then we start talking about some other kids. So this to me is more of a profile of what we would consider a traditionally gifted student. And I call them a traditionally gifted student because, as you can see, we have several areas of strength because they fall outside of those what we would consider to be typical boundaries. They also have relative weaknesses. But the important thing on this is that when we think of these as relative weaknesses down here, they're relative to the population, but they're true to the person. So for a person who has a lot of strengths up in this area, and then has some areas of weakness down here, the spread is still the same spread as it was for somebody whose needs fell within more typical ranges. I think the other thing to think about is, I'm presenting this in this more vertical up and down. Just because you have strengths up here does not mean these are positives. So don't misunderstand that, oh, they have all these positive strengths and they have all these negative weaknesses. It's not at all like that because I could say, maybe one of these things on here for me is my ability to talk way too fast. I wouldn't consider that a strength, but it is definitely, or a positive, but it's definitely a strength of mine. So just kind of keep that in mind when we're referring to these as strengths and weaknesses. They're not the same as positives and negatives. So this is a type of student who is, again, a bunch of things up in the strengths area, a bunch of things down the weakness area, some of the things that fall into these typical areas. This could be a student that we might consider gifted. This could be a twice exceptional student. This could be a student who is an English language learner, and maybe these weaknesses are relative weaknesses because they're learning English. And so, they've got some things there down here, but then their ability to learn new languages is up in this more strength-based area. So we don't really always, it's not always static, I think is the other thing to remember with some of these strengths and weaknesses is that they are snapshots in time. And while a lot of pieces of intelligence don't change over time, strengths and weaknesses can. And then this one is one that I would call my bestie. These are the ones that I spend most of my time with. And these are our kids who have genuine, true strength. They have strengths that are off the charts sometimes. They have weaknesses that are off the charts sometimes. They have some genuine weaknesses as well as some relative weaknesses. Um, and when we think again, not only about that idea of planning for the edges, but when you think about a kid who's living on these edges, this is a lot to manage. And we're talking about, whether it's interest or emotionality or, innate strengths, innate weaknesses, relative strengths, relative weaknesses, things that you might be able to learn to cope with, things that, at some point you might need to use pharmaceutical pieces to help with. We also want to think about kids who are not using pharmaceutical through their doctors, but I will tell you, I self-medicate for years with caffeine without realizing that that's really what I was doing. But when you have to drink a pot and a half of coffee a day to feel relatively normal, that's self-medicating. When we have our kids who, oh, they're not on medicine, but they're in 5th grade and they come to school with a cup of coffee every single day, they kind of are. So when we think about our social emotional learning and who our kids are, and who these profiles are, it again goes back to that social emotional learning is not just in the classroom. Social emotional needs are not just school-based. This is who they are all of the time, that they're living this all the time. And part of our job is to teach them skills and teach them things that they can use so that they can see themselves as productive people in the future. And that's why I want to hold off and go back to our to standard 6 now, because what this is actually telling us is that in order to be able to truly support our gifted and twice exceptional learners in terms of social emotional, one, you have to believe they exist. And then 2, you have to believe that they have these different needs. And just this awareness and getting a little bit of professional development around this goes a very long way to supporting these kids in the classroom. You don't have to be experts. You have to have exposure and you have to have understanding. Because once you are exposed to these ideas and you understand that these kids present weirdly or quirky or different, or, you know, you expect them to do one thing and they always do that one thing until they don't, and then they completely go off kilter. If you would kind of understand that that's typical for them and normal for them, it goes a long way towards making your classroom a more comfortable place, making them more productive learners, making them feel more valued as people, and overall being able to better thrive in your classroom. And then the last long piece of this is, and I think to me it's another, thank you, Hannah. Sorry, I just saw the chat. Um, the other thing that's really important is that gifted kids don't need gifted teachers to teach them. Gifted kids need teachers who are learners, who are interested in learning, who have a passion for knowing things, and who are willing to learn more about both the art of teaching as well as their content areas. A student doesn't necessarily, a student who's gifted is fine with a typical teacher if the typical teacher understands why kids like to learn and really is passionate about learning. Um, I've had, and I always, it's my favorite example to use, and I don't know why, but I had a third grader once, and he absolutely loved Greenland sharks. I don't expect any of y'all to necessarily love Greenland sharks. They are fascinating creatures. I actually love Greenland sharks, which is why I bonded with this kid, which is why I bring this up. At the time, he had a teacher who did not care anything about Greenland sharks. But what she would tell him when he wanted to talk about Greenland sharks is basically, I love that you love them. This is so, I love to see how excited you get about Greenland sharks. You know, what new things have you learned lately? How did you learn them? You know, what is the favorite way you learn? And, you know, now he and I, of course, are talking about all these different biologists and marine biologists that we follow and all the things that they're doing because that's what we do. But she was really interested to know that, you know, it wasn't just watching things on YouTube like some kids do, but we were talking about different like blogs that we followed and different cultures that and how they, you know, Greenland sharks obviously are primarily in Greenland, but we were talking about the different cultures and how all the cultures along the Arctic Circle treated the sharks differently in their histories and their mythologies. That was all really interesting for her to learn. Did she remember any of it? Probably not. I wouldn't expect her to, unless she got into it. But being able to hear and listen to what the students were talking about, what the child was talking about when he got excited about the sharks, was a way that she could connect with that student. And that's the important thing, I think, for all teachers to remember is that, you know, special education students don't need special education. I'm not saying this right. A good special educator doesn't need to have special needs themselves. It gives a different perspective if you do, but you don't have to. A good twice exceptional teacher doesn't have to be twice exceptional themselves. There's a lot of us who are. Um, I met with Claire today, and she and I were talking about the prevalence of twice exceptional people who teach twice exceptional kids. But it gives a different perspective, but you don't have to be. And then, you know, to teach gifted kids, you don't have to be gifted yourself, but you have to understand that they are and be willing to meet them where they are, which sometimes is going to be smarter than you are and smarter than you can be, because that's how they function in life. And so respecting them as learners and understanding them in that perspective is what's really important. I'm going to click through these kind of quickly because we're going to talk about this actually a little bit more in more detail with a different part of my presentations. Um, But you know, we talk about seeing growth, not grades, because we know that one of the biggest challenges we have with our gifted kids are the adults in their lives who and the expectations that they have. Um, so when we're talking about social emotional learning, we want to talk about practice and progress. We want to get rid of this idea of practice makes perfect. We are going to do a whole thing on perfectionism in a little bit, so I'm not going to like jump too deeply into this, but the gifts are really cool, so I'm going to click through them anyway. But really helping the kids find out where they are, define who they are as people, and not define who they are as compared to others. The one thing I want to talk about here is Q-tip. Q-tip is one of the best things. I don't remember where I learned it, but it's quit taking it personally. And especially for I always forget what this is called, but it's the ADHD thing where like I just assume everybody hates me all of the time. Like I start every single one of these classes assuming that you guys are all annoyed and don't really want to be here. And you can tell me you want to be here all you want. I'm not going to believe you. It's just part of who I am. It's part of, there we go, the rejection sensitivity dysphoria. See, that's why Hannah's here. She's like my word bank right now. Um, like that is the life I live. I go into every meeting assuming people don't want me there. I start every class assuming nobody wants to be here, but you guys are getting credit, so you're going to be here anyway. It's just how things are. Um, when you have that going on with you, and then you have a kid who tells you they hate you, it takes a lot to be able to say, it's not me. They don't actually hate me. They're in their own thing. They have something else going on right now, and take a step back from, they need to live their life. They need to say what they are. And you know what? Sometimes when you're somebody's safe person, they say a lot of really mean things to you. And you have to say, you know what, it's not personal. They are offloading on me, and that's okay. So I actually at one point I used to just keep like a Q-tip taped to the wall just because I knew if I had the word Q-tip up there, the kids would all ask me, and I didn't need to get into that with them. But having a Q-tip on the wall, they're just like, Miss Jackson's weird. She does things. And so they, maybe that's where it was. It was the CPI stuff that we got it from. Thank you, Emily. See, I knew somebody would remember. But I literally did. I had a Q-tip taped to the wall just as that reminder to myself that, um, you know, sometimes it's not about you. Most of the time, it's not about you. You're just the person in front of them a lot. And frequently, like I said, when you are somebody's safe person, um, they tend to unload on you, whether or not you want them to. So that is like the short of the intro to social emotional pieces. I'm gonna drink a little more of my water right now. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask or pop them in the chat.
Sarah, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the spectrums you were showing earlier with the sliders. So
Sure.
sometimes in discourse about ADHD and autism, I hear people say things like, well, isn't everyone a little ADHD? Isn't everyone a little autistic? And the answer is yes, but also mostly no. So the symptoms of ADHD and autism are all human characteristics. They are all things you are going to see amongst all people. However, it's also true that you could experience lower back pain and nausea and irritability, and that doesn't make you pregnant. So, just like that, having some of the symptoms or traits of ADHD or autism do not make someone autistic or do not make them have ADHD. And sometimes when we're considering gifted children or people who have those conditions, there tends to be a minimization of the effects of those disabilities on their lives, or sometimes even a complete flip where people will say, well, it's a gift that you have that. And it can be. It can be something that leads to a very creative mind and a different perspective on the world, but it's still a disability. Autism is disabling for me and for other people who have it. I can't speak about ADHD because I don't have ADHD, but I'm sure Sarah would agree that it is a disability. And I think that's it's important to keep in mind that children who are exceptionally bright and have these disabilities are still disabled, and they still need the supports that you would give a typical child who has that same disability.
I think that was very well said. Um, thank you. I distracted myself again. It happens. But the reason I distracted myself again, I'm always like 50-50 whether or not I'm going to read this. And I think I'm going to. I'm going to warn everybody that there's always a really good chance that I end up crying. I don't mean to. I really practice this, so if I do read it, I don't get upset, but um, it's a Tuesday and my ear hurts, so I can't promise anything. There we go. This is what I want to page with. So I think I mentioned this a week or so ago. Um, I received an award a couple of years ago on as a early leader in Choice Exceptional in the work that I do. And one of the things that I got asked to do was to write a short essay on like why I do the work that I do. And so I ended up writing this essay that kind of talks about how I got to where I am and why I do what I do. But the reason that I keep reading it is because it goes back to that future self piece where I so vividly remember things that happened to me when I was a kid, and it has led to everything that I do today. Um, so I'm going to read this. I'm going to try really hard not to cry, but if I do get upset, I'm going to turn off my camera and Hannah's going to magically take over and figure out what to do because normally I just would send us all on a break, but I don't know if we're going to have time.
Send me the slides before you start crying.
Huh?
I said, can you send me the slides before you start crying then?
I could send you the slides.
Those other ones.
I think this is the next set of slides we are going to do after this. Everybody can have the slides. But I'm reading from an essay, so I'm not putting those up there. All right. So this is called Coming Full Circle, My Journey from TUI Student to TUI Advocate. You are so smart, Sarah, my second grade teacher told me, but you can't learn because you have a problem. But the good news is there's a magic pill that can let you learn. You should talk to your parents. Literally what she said to me when I was 7. My problem, I had ADHD. I had ADHD in the mid 1980s when it was diagnosis du jour and everyone was taking Ritalin. My parents knew I was special. They had me tested, but they also decided medication wasn't right for me. My teacher was mad that my parents wouldn't give me the magic pill, and I spent most of the rest of the year sitting in the hallway or the closet because I was a behavior problem. I'm still a behavior problem. There were never any discussions about supports or other resources that might be available. No one mentioned gifted with disabilities, and certainly no one ever thought that perhaps all the problems I was causing in the classroom were due to boredom and that I had way too much time on my hands. All of my behaviors were attributed to this disease that my parents wouldn't treat. In fact, by the end of 3rd grade, my teachers refused to recommend me for the gifted program, then called the Highly Gifted Centers, because of my behavior issues. Ironically, the school that I would have gone to, had they sent me, actually had a GTLD program in 1987. Without the support of most of our local school system, we navigated the next 10, 14 years as best we could. Looking back, I can see how my access to assistive technology, scribes, mindfulness strategies, and strength-based learning practices helped me keep my head above water, but just barely. Most of those supports came from my blessed and saintly mother, who at this point has been my primary support through K-12, undergrad, 3 master's programs, and a career in education. There's a really good chance that some of the IEPs I write are completed on time, courtesy of my support system. And well, it was 2022 when I wrote this, it's now 2024. And I can still reflect on all that we in education have learned in 2 decades since my K-12 experience ended. Even in the last 5 years, our understanding of giftedness, disabilities, and of course the intersection of where these exceptionalities manifest in people who live with these complex brains. But what have we done for individual students? Although we've made great gains in research, it often feels like we've made little progress on impacting the lives of actual twice exceptional students in public schools. We hear stories every day of students who can't get into gifted programs because of limited special education resources, or a child who can't receive an IEP because their cognitive scores are too high. Or even on the rare occasion where the stars align and the gifted child can get an IEP, they struggle to receive services because how do I write a goal for a child who's already above grade level? I am fortunate to work in one of the few public school systems that offer direct services for twice exceptional students as a part of a continuum of services that both our special education and our accelerated enriched programs support. On the special education side, we have direct program services for students in grades 3 through 12, where students who require specially designed instruction in order to access advanced courses can receive their services in a cohort model. Beyond those services, we also offer consultative services to special and general education teachers, which involves working with school teams to build capacity in order to serve TUI students in their home schools. We also have these same services available to teachers and special educators in our schools with advanced learning programs to teach those who teach advanced learners on a daily basis how to plan and program for these students. On the accelerated and enriched curriculum side, we highlight best practices for twice exceptional and emergent multilingual learners as a part of our standard professional development. Interestingly, my position as the 2E instructional specialist is actually housed in our curriculum office as a part of the accelerated and enriched instruction unit. Not only does this create a unique partnership between curriculum and special education, which allows us to deliver a wider range of services for 2E students, both inside and outside general education, but it sends a powerful message across our system. Our message is that our students are gifted students who face unique challenges, but they are still entitled to receive challenging curriculum that plays to their strengths, while we teach to mitigate or remediate areas of weakness. As most people in central office will say, I miss the kids. I miss the direct impact I had on their daily lives. However, I do know through my work, I'm able to make a difference in the lives of thousands of 2E students, those who are identified and those who are struggling without understanding. I find joy in the growth I see in my central office colleagues who've expanded their understanding of twice exceptional. These colleagues stand with me now as advocates for 2E students. We have special education specialists coaching special education teachers in how to support advanced curriculum, and we have AEI specialists coaching gifted classroom teachers on their role in supporting, adapting, and modifying for 2E students. I'm also inspired by the feedback from classroom teachers when I'm out providing consults. It's rare now that I have to explain that 2E is a thing. Generally, I'm called out for consults for specific or nuanced cases. Educators who complete PD courses will say how important the learning is and how they can reflect on the number of 2E likely students they've had and how this learning changes their thinking. More recently, we've received a number of requests for deeper learning where educators are asking us to instruct them beyond the basic course in recognizing, serving, and differentiating for 2E learners. They're now asking us what's next. This is the major reason I do the work I do. Even though I know I won't see the faces of most of the students who benefit from the work we're doing, I know they're finding success because of it. Because of the work, we have more people at more levels in our system talking about 2E, 3E, and other special populations of gifted education and asking, what are we doing about this? And because of the work, we're no longer soloists in a cacophony of needs. Rather, we have now gained a large and growing choir of voices advocating for our 2E students. But ultimately, I do the work for my 7-year-old self in second grade, or for the Sarah the kindergartner who was told by her teacher that she didn't belong because 4-year-olds can't possibly read, and then got sent to the closet because I picked up a book and read it to her. I also got sent to the main office. That was the first day of kindergarten. Or third grade Sarah, or sixth grade Sarah, or college freshman Sarah, who got kicked out of biology lab and almost got kicked out of undergrad on the second day of classes. Because while I love the work and the students who grow from that work every single day, I fight for that little girl who endured so much from an education system that didn't understand her. And I owe it to her to make sure her suffering was not in vain. Sorry, I cried. But I'm going to recover a lot more quickly. Because the big reason that I read that is because I will bet you my second grade teacher doesn't know that I'm still upset for her telling me that I couldn't have a book. Because that's where it all started, is I was supposed to get a book. We were reading Super Fudge. We were supposed to read Super Fudge in our reading group, and she told me I wouldn't be able to because I didn't have this magic pill. And I got mad, as I tend to do. And I walked out of class and I went to the library and I picked up Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing and Super Fudge and Fudgemania. And I read all 3 books that night. And when I came back the next day and told her, she kicked me out of class for, I don't remember if it was back talking or who knows. I had my own chair in the principal's office. I got that chair the first day of kindergarten after I read that book to my kindergarten teacher. This is my life. This is who I am. We do things every single day that affect our kids, And as much as we can say, like Hannah said, giftedness can be a gift, but it also can look like this. And you can be 40 years old and still crying over things that happened decades ago. And as much as I laughed and I joked and I knew my kid was going to end up with this diagnosis, my daughter's second grade teacher was amazing. And I pre-warned her, like I think I even sent her the essay to read just because I'm like, look, I don't want my second grade issues to come out on you. But as a human being, she's an amazing person. And what she did for my kid this year was amazing. But I still cried when she got the diagnosis because I know that parts of her life are going to be like this. And there are parts of her every day that look like this. And I saw a video recently that we found. We were doing some stuff with our family, and it was a video of me from when I was, I want to say 5 or 6, doing the exact same things that my kid does. But seeing how my relatives around reacted, and I think about how I see teachers react, and it's a lot. And so when we talk about these social emotional needs and what these kids look like and what this means for them, like this is the reality behind some of it. And it's not dramatic like this every single day. Um, as I'm hearing drama coming up the stairs right now, because yep, she just got home from gymnastics, so we're all gonna get to see her in a hot minute. But this is a lot of the reality of Twice Exceptional. If you go back and look at the video that um, Kelly, I'm blanking on her last name right now, she actually did her dissertation on the impact of Twice Exceptional children in a family. And it was a small study, but it was a really interesting study for her to be able to interview the parents, the siblings, and talk about what having a Twice Exceptional family member is like on the family as a whole. Knowing that in some families, multiple family members are twice exceptional, and some it was just the one child. But the reality is, again, it is life. It is who you are. It's not just a school thing. So I think I am fairly recovered, but I also see it's almost 8 o'clock. It's almost like I timed that perfectly. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and have us go on break. I'm going to finish crying. And then when we come back, we're going to move into that presentation on perfectionism. And then the one after that we're going to talk about is going to be on executive functioning. Sound good? And pause. There we go. All right, now I think I'm recording. So I have to say the most important thing about this presentation are all the little cartoons. So you need to go back later and look at them because I spent way too much time making sure I had fun cartoons for this, which is usually how you know I have something else important to do because I spend a lot of time doing things that are silly. So we're going to talk about practice versus perfect, and we're going to start with a quiz because that is the best way to start every single session, right? So as I ask you the questions, I want you to put down either if you strongly agree, agree somewhat, cannot decide, disagree somewhat, or strongly disagree. And I'll read the questions out loud, and if you need me to slow down, tell me, but otherwise I'll give you about, we'll go quickly. So question number 1, I am critical of people who did not live up to my expectations. Remember, you're just writing first how you feel about it first. Strongly agree, agree somewhat, cannot decide, disagree somewhat, or strongly disagree. I get upset if I do not finish something that I start. I do things precisely down to the last detail. I argued about test scores that I did not agree with, even when they did not affect my final grade. Or if you need to adapt that, I argue about performance scores and what my boss says to me. After I finish something, I often feel dissatisfied. I feel guilty when I do not achieve something I set out to do. When a teacher handed back one of my papers, I immediately looked for my mistakes and not at what I did well. I compared my test scores with those of other good students in my class. It is hard for me to laugh at my own mistakes. And the last one, if I do not like the way I have done something, I will start over again and keep at it until I get it right. I.e., if you've heard me say multiple times, yeah, so I deleted the entire thing and started over again. I'll just go ahead and let you know what I feel about that last one. All right, now we're going to do some math. See, math is important in everyday life. So if you put down, for every strongly disagree, give yourself a +2. For every agree somewhat, give yourself a +1. For every cannot decide, give yourself a 0. For every disagree somewhat, give yourself a -1. And for every strongly disagree, give yourself a -2. And I will give you a strong 10 seconds to do the math. Yes, I see a hand.
Do you mind going back to like question 5 really quick? I think that's the only one I missed. I'm missing one.
Sure. Question 5 was,
Sorry.
after I finish something, I often feel dissatisfied.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Alyssa, did your score change since the last time we did this? I love it. All right, so we're going to roll through a little bit on these. So if you've ended up at a +15 to +20, you have to ask yourself, are you too good to be true? Are you over exaggerating how much time you put into things? Or are you putting way too much pressure on yourself? Because that is like up in that realm of like hyper perfectionistic. If you're in the +10 to +14, are you too good for your own good? Are you trying too hard? Are you pushing yourself too much? Spoiler alert, that's usually where I end up, in the 10 to 14. So no shame. The +5 to +9, you're in that borderline perfectionist. So maybe sometimes you're really pushing the perfectionist envelope, and sometimes you are able to roll to with the punches, not going too much to the extreme. +1 to +4 is what we're going to call that pursuer of excellence. And we're going to talk about that as we go through. But it's really you being able to turn it on and turn it off when you need to. You are driving your effort, and effort is not driving you, if that kind of makes sense. In that 0 to -5, it could be that you're making that conscious effort not to be too much. Even if you used to fall into a higher range, maybe you're working really hard not to get there. -6 to -10. I love it might be a slight exaggeration, but there is such a thing as overdoing, underdoing. -11 to -20, and generally when I talk to teachers, nobody's down here, but check your pulse. Make sure you're still actually there, because you can't really be apathetic about absolutely everything. I've tried, it doesn't work. And again, this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's also supposed to give you kind of this idea of where you fall, again, on a range. And there are days where you might fall higher or lower, and it might be situational. But we're going to talk about different types of perfectionists. And yes, my ELC friends, I apologize. You guys already heard this at least once during the year, but you're going to get it again. So we're going to talk about perfectionists and what it means to be a perfectionist, and what do perfectionists look like. And what we're going to talk about is that there are actually a lot of different kinds of perfectionists. So first, we're going to talk about these different profiles. We're then going to talk a little bit about myths around perfectionism, and then we're going to end this by going back to some things that we can do about perfectionistic tendencies and how we can support our students. So the first one we're going to talk about is our academic achiever perfectionist. This is our perfectionist that we mostly see in school. This is the one we're probably most familiar with. They require a lot of external validation. They need a lot of grades, degrees, kind of like I keep my degrees in the picture behind me. Um, they very much are comparative and competitive, even if they're not outwardly competitive, they're always judging themselves against where other people are standing. Um, they tend to overgeneralize poor performance, meaning that one bad thing is, oh my God, I suck at this. This is horrible. But they also tend to feel success in isolation. So, maybe they did get their degree, but it's not that big a deal. Everybody gets a bachelor's degree, everybody gets a master's degree. It's not that hard to get a PhD. You just have to do what you have to do to get there. So they really minimize their success and isolate that success. But then, getting a B or a C on a project is suddenly failing an entire course. One of the issues with this profile of perfectionism is that they tend to put their personal value based on that performance. And so how they feel about themselves is what that performance looked like, which is why they push themselves as hard as they do. So our next person, we call them the aggravated accuracy assessor. This perfectionist is never perfect enough. No matter what they do, they're never going to get there. It's a constant moving goalpost of success. And because they tend to focus on or hyper focus on their mistakes, nothing is ever going to be good enough. They tend to ignore everything to the point of that perfectionism. So whatever it is that they're focusing on to make perfect, they might ignore family, friends, they might ignore a social life. This might be our kid who goes home and studies 7, 8, 10 hours a night, even if they have straight A's. Like there's just, you can never get to that idealistic state. They also tend to see in their only perfect in their role models. So we all know role models are not perfect, but they're only going to see that perfectionism there. The interesting thing about these perfectionists is that they might be deleters or erasers and that it wasn't good enough, so I got rid of everything. And they might not turn their work in because it's never good enough. I did it, but it's just I couldn't. It was horrible. I wasn't going to turn it in. And they are almost embarrassed by what they consider their lack of perfect performance. And so even if they've done the work, they don't submit it. This is different than some of our others who don't submit work. So as we talk through these, one thing we are going to notice are some themes. The thing is the same, but the root cause of why is different. Our next perfectionist is the risk evader. This is the one who says, I can't, I actually, I used to have a saying when I was a kid, not frequently, but when I would get mad about things, I would say, if you can't be the best, don't bother being. That was a very negative thing. And obviously I was going through a little bit of an emo phase at the time, so we'll just call it what it is. But really, this is the one who, they know the answer, but they never raise their hand. You want them to take the honors course. Now, I am not a big person who says you've got to push kids, to always take the harder classes. But at the same time, if that's your strength and you're really good at it, but you're afraid you're not going to do well. So you'd rather get the A in the on-level class than try, and possibly get a B in the higher level class. This is also a student who is going to refuse to do work because if they feel like they can't get it perfect or it's not going to be good enough, well, I failed it because I didn't try. I mean, whatever. There's very dismissive of that sort of thing, because then they can ascribe their failure to a lack of trying rather than I tried really hard and it wasn't good enough. So they're constantly sidestepping all of the opportunities for challenge. Our next one is really our anxiety kid. It's the shoulda, woulda, coulda. What I should have done, what I could have done, what I would have done if I had just had whatever. This one, they tend to berate themselves. It's really, like I said, they're very anxiety driven. Um, you know, if I just had this, if I had just done this, if I'd stayed up later, or they do stay up all night because I should have done this earlier. I should have spent more time on this. And then when they get their results back, well, I could have been better if I had, done something differently, or I would have done this if it had been available to me. They're very obsessive about what wasn't done. And one of the things I know, especially when we talk about our twice exceptional kids, when we try and give them a reduced workload, they tend to freak out a little bit because they're so focused on what we didn't have them do. We might not have them do something for a legitimate reason, like you've already demonstrated mastery on those 6 problems, so I'm not going to make you do those 6 problems. I'm going to have you do the 2 harder ones. But you know, they obsess, but you didn't have me do these. I couldn't possibly have gotten a good grade on this because I didn't do the first 6 problems, even though you told me I didn't have to. They cannot accept praise. And I learned this from one of my other volunteer groups where, you know, people said, you did a great job. And you're like, oh, it was nothing. I've had to work really hard, and it's not because of perfection tendencies, but I've had to work really hard to be able to say, yeah, I did do a good job. I put in a lot of work and I worked hard, and thank you very much for noticing. When you're talking about this perfectionistic tendency, they can't do that. And so they hear the praise and they either dismiss it or they think it's sarcastic, but they definitely don't internalize what you're saying to them. So this is our image manager, and I like the example of being almost like a social media kind of person. I'm not saying social media people are perfectionistic. I'm using it as the example. Because the image manager cares about not whether or not they're perfect, but whether or not you think they're perfect. So they are very much about putting on their filters all the time. Now, whether that filter is hiding failure or that is, again, they're a deleter eraser because I don't want you to see the mistakes that I made. I've had students who will restart and keep rewriting papers because they don't want any erasure marks on the paper. It's old school, just roll with me on that. Or they're the ones who they kind of forget about version history, and so they delete everything off the page. There's never any wrong answers. They might not turn things in because, well, I mean, it was great. I don't know where it is. They know where it is. They just don't want to show you. It's all about that perception piece. One interesting thing I saw when I was reading about this, they use the example of an athlete who might quit at the end. You know, you have some people who, even if you're going to lose the game, you play hard till the whistle blows. I like basketball, so we're going to go with that. You play really hard till that whistle blows. But then you have some people who are like, oh, we're going to fail, so I'm just going to, you know, traipse up and down the court. I'm not going to pass very hard. I'm not going to try my best. We've already lost. And so that way they can step back from that failure, that loss, and be like, well, I wasn't trying my hardest. It wasn't even worth my time. So I didn't put, so again, when they do see the inevitable failure, they craft the reason, they craft the scene as to why that is happening. This is my procrastinating perfectionist. And I worked really hard to make this look all funky because I will tell you, this is a lot of the perfectionism that I see of myself, but this is our one who delays starting work because they very frequently experience perfectionism paralysis. They get this idea in their head of what it's supposed to look like. And if they can't figure out how to get there, they're not going to do it. Or they're going to put it off and put it off and put it off. And then that way, when they turn it in late or they turn it in poorly done, it's because I didn't have time to edit it. It was the last minute. What can I do? They create in their mind, it would have been okay if I had had the time, but I just didn't have the time to do it. So it's not the same anxiety as our coulda, woulda, shoulda. It's more of our, I didn't. And this is why I didn't, but you know what? If I had, it would have been great. You might still see the anxiety, but again, you see a lot of similar traits, but it's different than our other perfectionists. This perfectionism is very often, especially with a twice exceptional learner, is going to be very often paired with executive functioning disabilities. Because again, you've got this idea of how things could be perfect and you're thinking through how they're going to go, but you also can't shift to actually start. You can't shift to actually finish, and you can't manage your time to be able to make that happen. And so you tend to freeze, or you tend to, like I said, rush and just kind of push yourself at the end. And this is also tends to be our start the night before perfectionist. This is our all or nothing perfectionist. Like the media manager one, the social imager, they do care about the perception of others, but they care about the they care about the perception of others because that's how they manage what they are, because they are all or nothing compared to you. So it, like the other one, when I said, if you can't be the best, don't bother being, they're like, oh no, I am the best. You don't bother because I'm the best. They tend to overindulge in praise. They did really well on a homework assignment. Well, that's because I'm the smartest kid in the class and I know everything there is to know about this. But at the same time, if they fail, oh, well, that's not a big deal. They will put more emphasis on doing well on a project than they will on failing a class. Everything for them has to be, and then again, if they can't be that best, then you see total withdrawal, total refusal, because that way they can justify why they're not the best on something. This particular perfectionist tends to have mood swings, and their mood very much accompanies their perfection or their perceived perfection and that praise. Um, and you see a lot of extreme behavior with this. So sometimes you'll see the all or nothing because they already know it, but some of the already know it piece is more, it's not necessarily related to the perfectionism. They might use that as an excuse, but for a student who's, say, really good at a particular topic, we're more likely to see some other issues where, like, more about like self-esteem or other things where if I already think I know everything on the topic and then I fail a question on that topic, that and so now I feel like I don't know anything. That's more about I think the grit piece and more about some of the other social emotional pieces. It's not necessarily resulting or related to the perfectionism, but it could again look a little bit similar to that. Our all or nothing perfectionist is more worried about the image they're presenting as opposed to whether or not they actually know everything. If that, hopefully that makes sense. And then this is our last model example. This is our pursuer of excellence. And I said, we're going to come back to this from before. Our pursuer of excellence is not a perfectionist. The pursuer of excellence is somebody who is focusing on success and learning from mistakes. So you'll hear things that, again, are very similar to the perfectionist. They're focused on success, but they're not always able to learn from their mistakes. Mistakes are failures. They're very black and white in that thinking, whereas our pursuer of excellence is able to see more shades of gray. Criticism can be a way to grow. They balance their work and their social life, that work-life balance we talked about. They're defined by their effort and their outcome. And so unlike the all or nothing who wants to be the best, the pursuer of excellence wants to be their best. And there is a difference. And one thing that they work for is when work is good enough. So, and we'll talk about a little bit in a minute about what that is, but we don't want you to not do your best, but at some point you're going to do as good as you're going to do, and you're not going to drive yourself bonkers trying to make it perfect. And so that's, again, where that fine line falls in. So I have a quick side-by-side here. I'm not going to read all of them to you. I'm going to pull out just a couple to highlight. Specifically, the perfectionist who gets depressed and gives up when something is a failure versus a pursuer of excellence who experiences disappointment and then is able to move forward. That is a common theme, I think, with all of these, is the perfectionists get stuck. And whether they get stuck and don't start or they get stuck and can't let go, they're stuck. Whereas our pursuers of excellence are able to find that path forward and they're able to move forward. Perfectionists also tend to have everything about that perfectionism reflects on how they value themselves, whereas our pursuers of excellence know that their best and who they are is about the effort, and they don't, their self-value and self-worth is not linked to their ability to finish things in a way that they consider perfect. And so with that, we are going to move on to 7 myths about perfectionism. And I think that these are important to know before we talk about kind of how we combat them in the classroom, because I'll be honest, I learned something when I was reading them. And so I thought I'd bring them here. I like my cartoons, they distract me. So these are our 7 myths, and we're going to go through them individually. So no need to take notes. So myth number 1, perfectionism is always bad for children. Perfectionism is not bad for children. Healthy perfectionism, which again, we actually previously referred to as the pursuance of excellence. Normal, adaptive, pursuing excellence, developing pride in the work that you do, and driving yourself for success. We want to strive for our best. We want to pursue excellence. What we don't want is to become neurotic, maladaptive perfectionism, which is going to impact our behavior, impact our well-being. I think that's why I like that phrase, pursuer of excellence, because it is healthy perfectionism. It's the same thing. It's just a different way to say it that takes the word perfect out of the conversation. Another myth is that only gifted children are perfectionists. Perfectionism appears in all populations in equal measure. What we do know is that because we tend at school to see the academic pursuers of excellence, we tend to see the procrastinating perfectionism, and we tend to see some of the other pieces. And because that tends to manifest in gifted kids at school, we tend to see that more. And so in our minds, often gifted children look more like perfectionists. But if we remember, gifted is not the same thing as an advanced learner. And in kids who have advanced learning behaviors who are not gifted, had to work to get to where they are. They often have to put in more effort. They build in more resilience as they go. And because of that resilience piece, that actually is a mechanism to defend against perfectionism. And so if you are building that resilience and you've had to work hard to get where you are better able to combat the perfectionism. Whereas our gifted kids, things come easy, 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 easy. And then all of a sudden they're not easy. And we get into this mindset, well, when it was easy, it was perfect, and it was that. And so then we create this vicious cycle of, I don't have any resiliency, so now my self-worth is based on what I've been perceiving. So again, it's about a perception piece, and not all gifted kids will become perfectionists, but when those two are linked, that is often part of that root cause. So myth number 3, no one knows why some children are perfectionists. We actually do. We know, and we have research to talk about it. Reason number 1 are our dichotomous thinkers, our black and white thinkers. It's this or it's this. It's this or it's this. It's perfect or it's not perfect. And those are our only 2 options. I succeeded or I failed. There's no other in between. Working on nuanced language is a way to help combat perfectionism, and teaching kids to see those shades of gray is one of those things that we can do to help with the perfectionism. Living in environmental circumstance actually has a big impact on perfectionism. The ones that I found most interesting are 1, children of addicts. Children of addicts tend to have to control the environments that they're in. They live with obviously somebody who is not in a good mental place on their own, and they tend to, for a variety of reasons, lean more towards perfectionistic tendencies. Parenting style in general, parents who are dichotomous thinkers, parents who only insist on A's are the only way to go. And we know that that is a problem with our culture and our system in general, is that everybody thinks A is success and B or lower is failure. That kind of mentality really leads towards perfectionistic tendencies and helps and makes kids develop perfectionistic tendencies. And parents can do it at home even without grades. You know, your room is either clean or it's not clean. You're either this or you're this. So anytime we have that setup of dichotomous thinking. Firstborn children tend to be more perfectionistic. Again, I find it very interesting. I'm a firstborn child. I don't know that I necessarily would say I'm more perfectionistic, and that's why, again, it's a population thing. It's not saying all firstborn children are perfectionists, but it just does tend to be a thing that it does occur more frequently with firstborn children. The other one I found, the lack of parental approval, and what the research on that was saying is that when kids don't get any approval from the parents, they seek more approval. And so they keep trying to do better and better and better and better to get that positive feedback from parents, to get that attention. You can also find it in the other direction with, you tend to act out more and more and more because any attention is anytime you can get attention, positive or negative, you're going to seek that attention. So just like we tend to see a lot of acting out behavior when there's not parental approval, we also tend to see a lot of perfectionistic behavior when there's not the parental approval. One thing I did find very interesting with this is that parental perfectionism does not equal child perfectionism. There's no correlation there according to research. Obviously, if you have a parenting style, as we said earlier, that creates that dichotomous setup, but parents who are perfectionists don't necessarily have a dichotomous setup within their home. And so it's their own perfectionistic tendencies that they're managing, and it's not innately or necessarily passed to their kids. There's no way to identify perfectionism. There is, and common traits we've talked about so far. Ones that we haven't talked about, one would be workaholic tendencies. Um, y'all can just feel free to point fingers at yourself if you need to. I know that is one of my big downfalls, is that idea that like it always has to be a certain way. Um, you tend to spend too much time at work. You tend to spend too much time going back over things, too much time rereading emails to make sure the wording is exactly the way you think it should be. People who focus on mistakes and generalize minor mistakes are another signs of perfectionism. And then that concentration on external rewards. And I'm a little bit on the fence about that. I think when it's that concentration on external rewards, where you're also placing self-value on those external rewards, is when we're really thinking about those perfectionism pieces. Next myth, adults cannot do anything to help a young perfectionist. Absolutely you can. And we're going to go back to saying a lot of the same things. When you hear the negative thinking, help them reframe their thoughts, both in social and in academics. As we said before, we tend to see academics because we're teachers, but when we have perfectionistic behavior, it tends to be across their life. Just like with being twice exceptional, you're always twice exceptional. If you're a perfectionist, you tend to be a perfectionist in a lot of different areas. So if you see some of those perfectionistic behaviors in social interactions or play, you can interrupt that. And identifying mistakes and practicing the coping strategies around them, like things like growth mindset. Again, it was something as a buzzword, but there is value to it because that growth mindset helps build that resiliency and helps walk away from that dichotomous black and white of I'm smart or I'm not smart, it's perfect or it's not perfect. And then really emphasizing growth, how much a person has grown from where they started. There's only one type of perfectionist. So we've already talked about different profiles of perfectionism. This way is another way to group our perfectionists, which I thought were very interesting. You have your self-oriented perfectionists, and those are the ones who are, you're a perfectionist because you're holding yourself to a high standard. The other-oriented perfectionist is the one who you hold other people to a high standard. So these tend to be a perfectionist who is expecting better of you and putting a lot of pressure on other people. In social groups, we might call these kids our policers, where they're always like, but they did this wrong and they did this wrong and they did this wrong, and they're really expecting perfection of everybody around them. And then the last one is the socially prescribed perfectionism. And these are the ones who they focus on others because they believe that you are holding them to a high standard. And so you have to rise to meet their expectations. So again, you're becoming a perfectionist, but it is because of how you perceive others you think are perceiving you. Sorry you lost power. I haven't had the storm come through yet. I hope I don't, at least while class is going on. But if I disappear, don't expect to see me the rest of the night because we have an old neighborhood with old power lines. Perfectionism is not harmful, so I think we've already kind of addressed this. Interesting things again, not necessarily around the work piece of it, but the other social aspects. So higher rates of eating disorders. I found it really interesting that when we talked a moment ago about the self-driven, those tend to be people who suffer from anorexia, but the people who are driven by the social motivation, thinking others are holding them to a high standard, actually tend to be more sufferers of bulimia, which I thought was actually really interesting. Anxiety, excessive worry, which leads to depression and fatigue. So perfectionism can have physical aspects. Thank you, Bella. And then the suicidal ideation and attempts. And again, this is not something as a classroom teacher that you need to directly deal with, but you do need to be aware of, because you need to know what supports are available in school so that you can, if you do notice those tendencies, bringing it to the counselor, the psychologist. And so if you do see a kid who is hyper worried, they're always tired, they seem depressed, and you see those perfectionistic tendencies, bringing that to the attention of parents or counselors is really important. And Hannah noted, all these symptoms and disorders are more likely to occur in autistic people. We do tend to see that. Autism is one of the areas. ADHD for some of them, mostly the procrastination one because of the link to the executive functioning disorders. Executive functioning disorders that don't involve autism or ADHD. And then
I was referring to the ones on the very last slide you went over. So eating disorders are far more likely in autistic people as well as all of these other things here.
it is, I'm not gonna say good to note. I'm not gonna say interesting. I don't know what word goes with that, but thank you for noting.
So if you have a permanent disability, this is tangential, but if you have a permanent disability, you can get a free pass to all the national parks in the country. And I was telling a friend about that and she was like, that's so cool. Not the permanent disability part, which I think is kind of where you're treading right now.
That is exactly it. I wonder if ADHD counts as a permanent disability.
It does.
Really?
Yeah, you just have to have paperwork.
And this is why we go off on tangents. All right, back to our presentation. So overcoming perfectionism. So what can we do to help? I've said it a couple times, I'm going to say it again. When we talk about some of these things, what you're going to hear is very similar things. And it comes back oftentimes to the why we're doing it. So I might say, like for the first one, praising hard work over grade, or hard work and effort over grades. I'm going to say that for almost all of these guys, but the reason we're doing it for different ones is different. So for the academic achiever, when we talk about praising that hard work over grades, we really want to do that because we want them to place value in what it is they're contributing. The grade is, it's the teacher's opinion about where you are on standards. We can debate all the details around that at another time, but ultimately that's what it is how I think you performed on the standards. What matters is, did you try your best? Did you put forth your best effort? Did you do what we needed to, did you do what you needed to do in order to show me that you knew what it was that you were trying to achieve? That's where we're building that resiliency and grit and value in ourselves, as opposed to, did I get an A on this paper? Eliminating phrases, and this goes back also to that growth mindset piece, things like, you are so smart. You really, you put a lot of effort into that. I really like how you develop those thoughts. That seems to be a real area of interest for you. I like how you can bring new information to the table. Giving them things or to praise that doesn't have to do with something that might be considered fixed or innate. Helping them find their pride in progress. For this one, it's really interesting about not overgeneralizing success or failure. So you don't want to tell them good job. What you want to be able to say is, you did a really good job with how you improved your adjectives in this last paper that you wrote. You did a really great job in really using your formula sheets and making sure it was very clear what formulas you applied to your problems. You want to be able to tell them what it is they're doing well, so that it's harder for them to refuse it and it's easier for them to internalize it. And then teaching them how we use formatives and diagnostics to show mastery and improvement, so that again, it's not about, did I get an A, but rather, I couldn't write a paragraph at the beginning of the year, and now I can write 3 paragraphs pretty successfully. I don't care if we're supposed to be writing 5 paragraphs. Did you write 3 paragraphs successfully over 0? That's an amazing improvement right there. So helping them see that progress. For our accuracy assessor, the one thing I really like with this one is that think aloud piece. I, not shockingly, make a lot of mistakes. I'm actually a terrible speller. And so I always told the kids, like, because they're like, you teach English. I'm like, I teach writing. I do not teach spelling. So I would, if I spelled something wrong, I expected the kids to call me out on it, and I would go and fix it. Or I would stop and look up how to spell a word in the middle of class if I were writing something on the board and I couldn't remember how to do it. Being able to talk through my mistakes and own those mistakes in front of the class was a strategy that I used, so that the kids I had in the class, especially, again, I worked with a population of students who, we had a lot of perfectionists and hyper perfectionists in our group. So teaching them how I owned my mistakes and grew from those mistakes was a big part of the work that I did. Um, for our writers, I was trying to figure out what I meant there. For our kids who are the writers and deleters, teaching them to leave space and anticipate mistakes. Um, in the olden days, I keep talking about that, right? We used to write every other line and leave a blank line in between so that when we went back to make corrections, you could cross something out and write above it without having to squeeze it in or erase. That was something that my teachers, I remember, the ones I liked, I remember that we were really big on was never erasing your mistakes, always showing how you changed. Because it's not about presenting that final perfect product, but it's about showing your growth over time. And I know, and I actually showed this to a group of students once. Um, when I wrote my first master's thesis, I saved every single draft and I numbered my drafts. And my drafts go from the first one that's 10 pages and covered in red up to the like 21st draft or something was my final copy. And just being able to show them like how it went over time and say like there were a lot of mistakes along the way. Um, Giving them that visual of like mistakes are okay and this is how we grow from them. The other piece on this one is setting realistic goals and timelines, because again, this is the one who doesn't necessarily want to turn things in because it's not good enough. So having them set a goal and then sticking to that goal and having a timeline that helps them get to that goal will help them find that ending point. For our riskometer, um, forcing the issue. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of forcing the issue most of the time for students, but if we're talking about this particular profile, creating opportunities for them to take risks and then pushing them to take that risk. One of my favorite ways to do this when we're talking about kids who don't answer questions in class, and this is when I love equitable calling strategies, is I would, I would put out the question and then I would pull 3 names and say like, Hannah, Lisa, and Amy, you guys are going to give the answers next. So go ahead and, guys, I need these, but these are my first 3 answers. Or even afterwards, I'd say, okay, these are the 3 names I called. And no matter what order I called, and if I knew Hannah was going to be my riskovator, I would put her as second or third so that she would have a chance to hear an answer modeled. She'd have a chance to think about what it is she wanted to say, but she knew her name was going to be called. There wasn't a shock value there either. And it was an opportunity to be a small safe risk for her to take. And then either she'd hear me give praise to somebody else or give feedback to somebody else. And really talking, even if they get something wrong again about that phrasing part, I really like how you're thinking about that. I really intended for you to look in this part, or, let's think about it from this perspective instead. How does that change your response? Giving them those opportunities to feel success even within lack of success. I like that, rewarding the kids if they find errors on your slides. I couldn't afford that level of feedback for mine. Our shoulda, woulda, couldas. Short and long-term goals, helping them sit down and planning a timeline. And we'll say the same thing for our procrastinator friends. Helping them figure out how to monitor success and then making a task plan. How am I going to move through this? What is my outcome and how am I going to get through this? When you use rubrics, it's a great way to do it because you're not doing a whole lot of extra work. What you're doing is, this is the end product. Let's make sure we know what the checklist is to get you there. Don't overset your goals. If I say a 5-paragraph essay, please do not give me a 10-page essay. Sometimes it's appropriate, but for this particular profile, it's not. And if they want to expand it, then we want to show them incrementally how to do expansions in certain ways. But really what we're saying is this is our end goal and this is where we're going to get to, so that when they get there, they're successful. And then having those opportunities for self check-in and then teaching them how to use positive self-talk and self-praise. What did you do well? When you turn in a paper, tell me 3 things I should look forward to reading in your paper. When I'm turning in your assignment, which math problem do you think you really rocked it on that you want me to grade first? Having them identify their own success, it goes a long way towards this type of perfectionist. So our image manager is an interesting one. This is one where we actually want to possibly talk about them having some social skills instruction to learn to own that failure and understand that they are not a failure just because they have failed at something. Helping them, like everybody else, finding the pride in the process and the work in the process. Helping them find role models who either work through failure or success or have owned some of their failures. Helping them find self-focused goals and not other focused goals. So that goes back to our basketball team. Who cares if the team is going to lose? Did you put forth your best effort? What does your best effort look like? How do you hustle yourself up and down the court? How do you put forth that you're doing what you need to do? And then with these guys also applauding risk taking, because some of that changing goals from others to self is a risk. And so helping them own that risk and applaud them for taking those risks. Our procrastinator friends, like I said, when we're talking twice exceptional, most of the time, these are our friends that we're talking about. Breaking down processes into smaller and smaller and smaller steps. One piece of feedback I definitely often give for general education teachers when they tell me, well, I gave them a timeline, I gave them a rubric, and it didn't help. It's not that it didn't help, but what you think is broken down isn't broken down enough for them. There are times where maybe we have broken it down even to a class period, but they literally don't know what the first step looks like. Sometimes we have to hand them that first step. That's what a sentence frame is all about, or a sentence starter. It's not that they don't know how to write a sentence. It's that the blank page is so scary that they can't take that first step forward. If you haven't done it, I highly recommend out at the Grand Canyon. They have this glass bridge that you can, it's like a loop, and you can walk out over the Grand Canyon and you can step out on the glass and look straight down into the canyon. It is amazing. But what I can't do is I tried this with my sister. I cannot, it's frosted on one side and clear in the center. I cannot look down and take that first step. I can look up and take that step and then look down, no problem. I can walk up to the edge and look over the edge, no problem. But I could not step from the frosted to the clear. It was too scary. That's what the procrastinator can feel like. That first step is just so scary, it shuts everything else down. So it doesn't matter how much they know on the subject if they can't get themselves started. When they feel fear, their fear is real. And so helping them get over that piece to move forward, helping them with timelines. And then this one is, I think, a big one for this particular profile, which is grade the draft if necessary. And that can look like a whole bunch of, when we get to strength-based instruction, we'll talk more about this, but really helping them. You did so much of this work. It doesn't matter if it's a final draft, if I'm grading you on content. If I'm grading you on writing, can I grade chunks of your writing and not the entire thing? Can I have you do a really amazing first paragraph and then outline 3 other paragraphs and grade you on content for the rest of it instead of pushing for the entire thing? Those are all ways we can help a procrastinator manage. Procrastinators are going to be procrastinators forever for the most part, because even if they're not perfectionistic procrastinators, they're still going to be procrastinators. So helping them strategize how to get through that is a big part of working with this profile. Our all or nothing kid, we're back to helping them redefine that success in terms of themselves. So we've said this for a couple of them, but for them, it's because they need to look at themselves and know, I'm not about being the best, I'm about being my best. One thing we know with this particular one is being very specific in criticism and praise. Like we said earlier, they tend to overgeneralize praise and over minimize failure or criticism. So we, again, want to be very specific. You did a great job on this. You really need to work on this. And helping them really see their work for what it is and not overinflating it or overly dismissing what it is that they're putting forth. This student also really needs help with mindfulness strategies because, like we said, a lot of their mood can be based on whether or not they're feeling perfect. So helping them find ways when they're stressed or frustrated, especially if they are perceiving that they're not the best, helping them find some self-calming strategies. This is a moment in time. This is what I'm doing. I need to see the bigger piece. I need to be more on my, I need to be more about who I am and not necessarily about what my performance on this one thing is. And then our last friend, our pursuer of excellence. We need to remember that this is not a static state. You can move in and out of these zones of perfectionism. you can be a perfectionist and become a pursuer of excellence and slide back. It can be in classes or in certain times of the year. So when we have our pursuers of excellence, don't just assume they're fine, because they can slip and slide at any point in time. We want to make sure that they're on track. We don't want to overuse them as the example. That sets them up socially, but it also puts pressure on them to always be the example. So even when they're doing, even if they consistently do a great job with managing their success and perfectionism, they should not always be your example. And that's a great time for a kid who struggles to maybe be the example. You know, I saw you've been really doing, like, look how they've been doing with managing their task list. And I really like how they're moving this project forward, but not always on our pursuer of excellence. We've talked about the specific praise, making sure you're communicating with families. We don't want to find out that we're seeing a pursuer of excellence in school because they are so perfectionistic at home that we're not seeing it. So remembering that communication with families is key. And then make sure they don't fall into the trap of when okay becomes good enough. I talked earlier about, they know when it's good enough. We want to go ahead and turn it in because I've done my best work and I'm ready to turn it in. What we don't want them to become is, oh, it's good enough. I'm fine. I'm just going to go ahead and turn it in. Because much like we did in our quiz in the beginning, where we went from the extreme, I'm always trying to show you that I'm perfect, all the way down to the do I have a pulse. We don't want them to fall into do I have a pulse where they're apathetic about it. We want them to maintain that pursuit of excellence. So I know I'm running up right against the end of class. This is just my quick takeaways piece for perfectionism. You know, it's many different forms. We need to find value beyond grades. Our language and how we speak to the students and how they speak about themselves is a huge piece of working with and combating perfectionism. And sometimes you're going to have a kid who needs help more than you can do as a classroom teacher, and that's okay. That's why we have school psychologists and administrators and counselors. And if you feel like it is beyond what you can handle, go to them. That's what they're there for. You guys have all of this in the, oh, no, stop. There we go. All of these things on this page are actually also in our classroom, our Canvas page. So you guys have all that. I managed to end at 9. I'm pretty proud. I know I had one more thing. I was hoping to get to executive function today. Apparently I decided to try instead. So we will get there, I promise. Our next class on Thursday, we're going to have our guest speaker, and I really need to call him because he's asked me to like 3 times, and I'll get there. Luckily, he very much understands procrastination. I think I addressed most of like the Canvas kind of related questions, so I'm just gonna go ahead and say goodnight and turn off the recording, but I'll stick around to answer questions that people have off recording, unless anybody has any questions they want to ask with the recording on. All right, and I will say goodnight.